Greetings, everyone. This is Professor Theo Williams shooting a video going over both forms number one and form discussion number two. Just wanted to chime in briefly in regards to some of your responses as well as to give a little bit of my own contribution. So, for form number one, we had two questions. The first question was, what cultures do you belong to? And then secondly, are there any cultural identities that you have that complement or conflict with one another? And the whole impetus for this particular forum was to do two things. Number one is to establish the fact that all of us are multicultural individuals. We all have cultural identities, and it's not just one particular culture that we belong to. Most of us may not even know that. Oftentimes, here in America, especially when we think about culture, we equate culture strictly with race and ethnicity. So when someone says, "What's your cultural background?" we're going to talk about our race. For example, I am black. Or some people may refer African American, different terms at nature. But we don't realize that culture basically are any groups that we belong to that influence our attitudes, our beliefs, our values, and ultimately our behaviors. And so, me being a man is also a cultural thing, because gender is a social construct, and there's certain rules and that we and roles that we associate with being a man. Same with being a Christian, same with being a husband and a professor. So all those are cultures that I belong to, and they all influence my cultural identities. So for this particular question, it was really good to just see you all discover. For some of you already knew, but for some of you, it was a time of discovery that hey, I do have culture, and not just one culture, but I belong to many cultures. So it was good just to read the different list of the cultures that you belong to. And I think it was very telling when we got to the second question, which I'll spend more time on when you all began to talk about how some of your cultural identities complement one another and how they conflict with one another. One of the reoccurring themes that several of you chimed in, it seems as though in terms of having cultural identities that complement each other, that's normally the case if the particular cultural identity that you are speaking about is a positive one. So you could talk about the positive aspects of one identity and the positive aspects of another identity. However, if there was any cultures that had maybe some negative aspects to it, that's often when some of the conflict would come up. And one of the positive cultures that often conflicted with your other cultural identities was in terms of religion. So several of you said, well, here's some particular cultures I belong to, and here's some of the norms of that particular culture. But when it comes to my religious culture, whether it's was Christianity or what have you, that you would often have some conflicts. You know, some things that you did in a part of this culture didn't necessarily always match up with those values and beliefs that were a part of your Christian culture. And so I thought that was very interesting. It makes a lot of sense. I think about my life before Christ and my life after Christ, the things that I got involved in, and oftentimes some things I stopped doing and some people I stopped hanging around with was because my new cultural identity as a believer in Christ oftentimes conflicted with some of the other identities I had. You know, for example, being an athlete, one of my things, athletics made me very prideful. I thought I was the man when it came to basketball, and opened up the door for so many other things for me to get involved in that I probably shouldn't have got involved in. And then when I became a Christian, all of a sudden now I'm learning these different principles about humility and selflessness and preferring others to myself. And that kind of conflicted with a lot of things I had not necessarily been taught from basketball standpoint, but just the things that came with basketball. However, there were some things that complement each other. So with basketball, I really learned how to be a teammate, that each person had to carry their weight, that the team was only as successful as the weakest link, and that not one person was bigger than the whole team, and how we all had to work together with a common goal and common purpose. Well, that reminds me a lot of what we read in the Bible as far as the body of Christ. One body made up of many parts. and the hand and the feet and the eyes and the ears, and we all need each other. And so, in order to be successful, so there are some ways in which they complement each other also. Some of you mentioned how some of your cultural identities that you possessed may have complemented or conflicted with the cultural identities of some of your close family members, or some even mentioned their spouse. That maybe you thought one way and your spouse thought a different way about certain subjects, and how those can sometimes clash. And someone also broke down that even within the same culture, that people within that culture can have differing views, and that not everyone within the same culture thinks alike, has the same values and attitudes. Because that's a misnomer that if we're all men think alike, all women think alike, all black people think alike, all Christians act the same way. But there's room for us to even be within certain groups and still have our own unique personalities, our own unique way of looking at things, perspectives, and our own unique attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So I thought that was very interesting that some of you pointed out that even within the same cultures, that you may have some distinctions there. And so one thing I noted, that we're not a monolith. We're not homogenous, even within the same culture, And so I think about from being black, that not all black people think the same. Not all We don't always agree on the same things, and so we can't just lump everyone up in a particular group based upon a particular cultural identity that they possess. Because what that does, it really compartmentalizes, and it doesn't take into account the other identities we possess. So maybe if it was just me looking at it from in terms of race, maybe I would have a whole lot in common with the other black people who I come in contact with. But since that's not my only identity, some of my other identities may have some influence also. So maybe my Christian identity, maybe my professor identity, different identities influence me. So it makes it so I may have some things in common with other professors or other Christians that I may not have in common with someone who's black. Or I may have something in common with someone who's black who may be a non-Christian, because maybe our blackness at that time becomes more salient. And so it just goes to show you that any given time, our cultural identities may be strong, they may influence us, but it doesn't mean that we're always bound by those identities, because we're influenced by some of our other identities also. Another thing you all pointed out in this particular forum was that changes within a particular culture can take place over time. And one of you wrote specifically about church culture, how, the way you grew up in church and how church is viewed now is differently. And this is just such a profound observation. So even when you think about what it means to have church culture, well, guess what? Culture changes over time, and one of the primary reasons why culture changes over time is because people change over time. And we are the primary consumers and producers of culture. And so I think about church when I grew up in the church, some of the reverence and some of the things that took place there that may not exist now. And just the overall importance of church. Regardless of what, of a walk with Christ, personally speaking, culturally speaking, come Sunday morning, you're going to church. That was just the way things were. And you can almost do what you want to do Monday through Friday, and then on a Saturday night, you can go do whatever you want to do. But come Sunday morning, you got to be in church. That was almost like a cultural thing. Whereas now, it seems to be that most people, church may not be as important. They're emphasizing other things. Yet there may be some things that have stayed the same in positive ways, and there may be some things that are negative that have stayed the same over time also. But that's definitely something we need to recognize, that culture does change over time. Think about how we view marriage, and maybe divorce being more taboo back in the days, and now divorce is less taboo and it's more common, and you have more and more people getting divorces. And so just because you're part of a particular culture doesn't mean everyone in that culture is the same. And just because you're still in a particular culture doesn't mean that culture itself is the same. It changes over time. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover. Oh, yet someone else also wrote about the nuances and the intricacies within a particular culture, especially a culture like, say, for example, I think one of the examples was the Hispanic culture, that we who are not a part of that culture tend to lump all Hispanics or Latinos together. We think they're all from one country, not recognizing that there's dozens upon dozens of countries that you can be from and still be considered Hispanic or Latino. Same thing if we say someone's Asian. Well, are they Chinese? Are they Korean? Are they Vietnamese? Are they Japanese? It could be from so many different places, and even within black communities, are we black, African American? Within the Native American, is it Native American, Indian, First Nations, Indigenous? Do you want to be called by your tribe? There is no clear-cut set of rules. Not all black people prefer being called black. Some people prefer being called African American. Some people prefer other names, just American. Not all Native Americans prefer Native American. Some prefer Indian. Some prefer Indigenous, First Nations. Some prefer being called based upon their tribe. And so when in doubt, we shouldn't get caught up in saying that we think we know it all. We should just ask and try to contextualize our communication based upon the people that we're in relationship with. All right. So that is a quick breakdown of form number 1. So let me go on to form number 2. And the question was, how important was it to look at from communication from the standpoint of having a working working knowledge of history, anthropology, sociology, psychology, things of that nature, economics. And as I touched on the PowerPoints and on the lecture, one of the coolest things about the field of communication is it's interdisciplinary. A lot of the common theories that we have, a lot of the terminology we use, a lot of the things that we use in our particular discipline comes from other fields. So we bring in stuff from psychology. We bring in stuff from sociology, from anthropology, from theology, from philosophy, all those things, history. And I think it's important because ultimately when you're talking about communication, what you're really talking about is people. And you can't just understand people from a communication standpoint. You can't even understand the communication that people engage in strictly from a communication standpoint. You want to know the history behind it. You want to know how we're created. You want to know what the thought process is, our belief systems. All those things influence who we are, influence how we communicate. So I think overall it's very important. And that's what chapter 2 is really dealing with, that multi-layered approach to understanding who we are interculturally, not just looking at it from one aspect, but multiple aspects. And so here's some of the things that you all chimed in. One person said, only when all things are considered and understood does the real effect of intercultural communication expose itself. That's very true. We can't go into an intercultural communication interaction thinking that we all have it all figured out or just approaching the interaction from one particular standpoint. We got to approach it from multiple perspectives in order to really grasp the richness of that interaction. Someone says the lack of knowledge does cause difficulty in understanding interpersonal communication. So although it's me talking to one person one-on-one, and I could assume that the only thing I need to know is a little bit about that person. However, how that person communicates, how I communicate, how we understand each other is also influenced by our upbringing, our viewpoints, our frame of reference, our experiences, how we see ourselves within the greater context of society in terms of history, who we are as human beings. All those things will influence those interactions. So the more we can know about those different disciplines, the better our communication is going to be. Someone said it's very important to get knowledge about a culture's history, economics, social science, anthropology, politics, and communication, because these are the base of the culture. They shape and enrich the culture. This person that used the analogy of the pyramids, they're saying this is the base, this is the foundation. And so you got to know all those foundational things in order to better understand that person. Someone says a great knowledge of history affects communication positively, while a lack of knowledge of history can affect communication negatively. This is most often the case that if you don't know history, you could easily communicate in such a way that you say the wrong things. I get this a lot with certain colleagues who may make a particular statement, say a particular phrase, but not necessarily consider the historical context that that phrase may have when dealing with certain people. And maybe they would say, well, when I was raised, we could say this and it would meant a compliment. And I'd be like, well, where I'm from, that same phrase is kind of downplaying or minimizing. It puts down. Well, if I don't, and if each other don't have a working knowledge of history, we'll take that stuff out of context. So knowing history, knowing those things is very important. But conversely, sometimes knowing history can actually be a negative thing. I think about sometimes how we're jaded by history. Because of the hurts and pains, historically speaking, it may be difficult for us to function in the present with certain people. So maybe if we didn't know as much about history, sometimes we would give people the benefit of the doubt and deal with them based upon who they are and not necessarily judge them within the context of historical facts. So I think there's a balance. But overall, knowing history is very beneficial. Someone else says a great knowledge of history. Oh, okay, I already did that one. My apologies. Learning intercultural communication is not just how we communicate with other cultures. This is true. It is learning the how and the why they communicate the way they do. Not just, and I wrote in, not just the outcome or product, but looking at the motives, the process, the procedures. This is very important. Sometimes we simply judge people based upon their behaviors, what we see on the outside. We judge the product. Yet, it's more important that we also take in consideration the process. How did they become who they are? Why did they communicate a certain way? Why did they behave a certain way? When we take those things into consideration, we're not just judging based upon the outcomes and the behaviors and the actions. We're also looking at motives. We're also looking at the role that history plays. We're looking at upbringing. And all those things are going to help influence how we understand what we just witnessed. Someone gave the example about the NFL protests. They said that sometimes we can view the act itself as being disrespectful to the flag, but needed to take historical factors into account. Very important. I teach another class here on campus that deals a lot about these issues of how we can receive a particular message. And then based upon our own frame of reference, our own history, our own experiences, our own hang-ups, our own preconceived notions, we can interpret that message in a way that most suits us. And we may interpret it a way that the person who delivered the message never intended. And so a lot of those NFL players, they kneeled, and most were very clear on why they were kneeling and why they were not kneeling. Yet as audience members, some of us may say, no, I'm assuming that they're kneeling for this other reason. And we just judge the action without taking the time to take in consideration the why. What role does history play in this? Is there some things that I'm not privy to that may help better explain their motives, their purpose, their intentions for doing these particular acts? And I think that's what we're getting to when it comes to this intercultural communication. We can't just look at the outcomes. We need to be able to understand more about the why and the how and the what and all those things. And then finally, some people chimed in about the four layers: the individual layer, the interpersonal layer, the organizational layer, and the cultural layer, and how those built upon each other, and how oftentimes that each each layer influences the other layer. And so I thought overall you all did some great stuff. I want to encourage you all to continue to chime in with your initial posts, as well as chiming in with your feedback to your classmates. If this was a class where we were on the ground, we wouldn't have to have these, we would be getting this in class and doing great class dialogue. But since it's online, it's going to be important that you contribute to the overall discussion by those initial posts and then the responses that you have to your roommates. I see some papers have started to come in. I want to encourage you to continue to turn those in. Realistically, it's going to take me probably about 10 to 12 days to get all those graded. We have close to 20 students in the class, and I am teaching 5 other classes, and so I've started grading the ones that came in this weekend. I'm going to continue to grade those. So people should start to see grades early next week. But some of you may not see grades to the following week. And so just keep that in mind. But I purposely scheduled the class so that I would get these papers back to everyone with at least a full week before the next assignment is due, so you could look over those papers and not make the same mistakes, grammatically speaking, on the next assignment. And so just ask for some grace, some patience, and I'm going to get those back to you. They're going to be very thorough, and I really want to give you some great feedback. Until next time, this has been Professor Theo Wins with a commentary on form number 1 and number 2. And I look forward to hearing from you all in regards to form number 3. Take care and God bless.